I want to share two stories. The first begins like this. A long time ago, in a faraway place, there was a prince. And the prince was looking for a bride. And so as he discussed it with his father, the king, he tried to determine what would be the best way to choose a bride for himself. And so in consultation with his father, the king, the prince decided that what he would do is he would travel the whole kingdom and he would look at the hands of every young woman in the kingdom. And he would marry the woman with the most beautiful hands in the world. And so the prince began the long duty of finding his bride. And so from village to village and from town to town, he would ride on his horse and he would gallop into town and he would tie up the horse and he would begin to go from house to house, looking at the hands of all the young maidens in the land. And out of every town and every village, he picked one young woman who had the most beautiful hands in that whole village. And on a certain day, all of those young women from all over the kingdom were summoned to the king's castle. And on that day, the prince was going to compare all the hands of all of the winners from all the villages and from all of the towns all over the kingdom. And so the day came. And all of those young women came with their highest hopes that they would be chosen as the woman with the most beautiful hands in the kingdom and that they would become the bride of the prince. And so as they came, one by one, and took their place in the castle, one young woman was still on her way, and she was almost to the castle, and she heard a cry of distress. She had the driver stop. She got out of the carriage, and she began to follow the sounds that she heard, the cry of distress. She kept following, and pretty soon she couldn't see the carriage any longer, and she was off at the edge of the woods, and finally she was close enough to see where the sound was coming from. Over in the bushes, she could hear a distressed animal crying. She walked close enough to see it, and down deep inside of a thorn bush was a small animal that was trapped. The animal couldn't get out because of the thorns. Any way it moved, it would hurt. And so it was just sitting there crying. And moved with compassion in her heart, this young woman, without thinking of the cost, without thinking of why she was there, without thinking about her beautiful hands that were about to be judged by the prince, without thinking about any of that except the safety of this small animal, and understanding and knowing that this animal could never save itself, she thrust her hand into that thorn bush and pushed the thorns apart and allowed that small animal to scamper away. It was only then that she realized what she had just done. The stinging pain began to be noticed, and she looked at her hands, and they were covered with blood, scraped and scratched and pierced by the thorns. All of a sudden she remembered she was on her way to the castle. The prince was going to look at her hands and judge whether or not she had the most beautiful hands in the kingdom. She began to cry and weep and made her way back to the carriage. She told the driver to just turn the carriage around and go back home. There was no sense in showing the prince her hands. But he couldn't be persuaded, and so he continued on the next few hundred yards across the drawbridge into the castle. And there the prince was already looking at all of the hands of the young maidens from all over the kingdom. Reluctantly, ashamedly, with her head down and tears still staining her face, the young woman walked up to take her place in the line. And one by one, the prince picked up the hands of the maidens and looked at them and examined them and tried to determine whose hands were the most beautiful. And finally, he got to that young lady who had put her hands in harm's way in order to rescue another. At first, the prince was astounded. He said, "What happened to your hands? I remember your hands from when I came to your village. They were so beautiful." And so she began to recount to the prince the story of how she had been moved by compassion to save that small animal, had thrust her hands into the thorns, allowing the animal to go free. Prince was moved with compassion of his own. He took her hands and he held them in his, and he said, "These are the most beautiful hands in the kingdom. For these are the hands that were willing to scar themselves to save another." Story number 2 begins this way. A long time ago, in a faraway place, there was a prince who was looking for a bride. And he went to his father, the king, and he said, "Father, it's time." And his father said, "Son, I know where your bride is. I know where they live. I know where they reside. They are caught up in a thorn bush. The thorn bush called sin, and they can't escape." And the father said, "I've sent my best prophets. I've sent men and women to testify of God's mercy and grace. I've sent Elijah and Elisha. I've sent Zechariah and Moses. I've sent Joshua and Abraham. And instead of being able to free my people from the thorn bush of sin, instead, they themselves have gotten trapped in the thorn bush. And there is no one left to rescue your bride except for you." And the prince said to his father, "But Father, how shall I save them?" And the father said, "You must be willing to thrust your hands into the thorn bush of sin and make a way of escape for your bride." And the prince said, "But Father, these hands fashioned the mountains and carved out the canyons. These hands put the stars in place, and the moon and the sun. These hands took mud and formed a man. These hands took his hand as he took his first breath. Father, these hands are the most beautiful hands in the kingdom. the Father said, Son, it's the only way. So, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish in the thorn bush of sin, but have eternal life. And so Jesus came, and he thrust himself into the thorn bush of sin, tempted in every way as we are tempted, exposed to every temptation that we are exposed to. He came. He came for his bride, and when others had failed and nothing else could free them from their predicament, Jesus thrust his beautiful hands into the thorn bush of sin and parted the way and made a way of escape. On that Good Friday, his most beautiful hands were taken and nailed to a cross, scarred forever, marred with the piercings of sin. Now we know the end of the story, or we think we do. There came a day when the prince came back to his father. His work on earth was done. And he came into his father's throne room and he said, Father, I've done what you ask. Father, I used to have the most beautiful hands in the kingdom, but now they are scarred and marred by sin. But I've done what you ask, and I now have a bride. And the Father took the Son's hands and held them in his and said, No, son, now you have the most beautiful hands in the kingdom. Jesus came, spurned, rejected, assaulted, pierced, and killed in order to allow his bride to become his bride. You can preach and teach about theology and doctrine. You can make it about denominations, and you can make it about rules and regulations, and you can make it about lots of things that it has nothing to do with. The truth is that it only has to do with this. Jesus came, thrust his life into the thorn bush of sin, rescued us by dying on the cross, and today offers us the free gift of eternal life simply by putting our faith and our trust in him. He doesn't make us jump through hoops. He doesn't make us keep rules and regulations. He doesn't make us do all the things that so many people tie up with salvation. He simply says, you're free, accept your freedom. I've made a way, simply receive it, accept it. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life.